Which one is getting the attention of executives more? Service disruptions or safety? Which one is getting them to say, it's about time we start really looking at security?
It's a good question. I think that in service disruption, the case is a bit simpler because with safety, so service disruption is something that has a very measurable ROI, and it's like you understand that.
This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and this is the Unsolicited Response Show. We're through the summer doldrums. My daughter is back to school, and the content schedule is back up and running, so I hope you're enjoying the articles, the weekly episode, the S4 videos we're putting out. Lots of good content for you, and I expect to pretty much keep on schedule through the rest of the year. A lot of things to cover. As always, I want to remind you that the S4 call for presentations is up until the end of this month. Then we'll look through everything we got and all the maybes. We'll get yeses or nos. We're still looking for content. It's 3 days on 3 stages. None of the sponsors get a free session on any of the stage, so we've got to fill them all up with great talks. I'd encourage you to go to s4xevents.com/CFP, get all the details, or just send me your idea, s4@digitalbond.com. Now, this episode, we're talking rail. I'm talking with Miki Shifman, who's with a company called Cylus out of Tel Aviv. And we spend most of the episode talking about rail security, about the safety systems, about the systems that would control the reliability, the service capability of keeping the trains running. That's most of the focus, and trying to really understand how rail works, who the players are and such. At the end, we talk a little bit about Cylus. And I found them very interesting because, as most of you know, I covered the OT detection space very closely since 2016, when there were 20-some companies and then down to 10, and now we're pretty much down to the big 3, Clarity, Dragos, and Nozomi, along with the ones that were acquired, your Tenables, your Ciscos, your Microsoft, and such. So it seemed like the market had played itself out. But then I came across this Cylus company who focuses just on rail, and they're taking the strategy of having a very similar product, a product that is monitoring traffic, identifying what's on the system, looking for anomalies, looking for threats, providing information to the operator, but they're solely focused on the rail sector. So the question is, can a focus on a specific sector, both in terms of your marketing, your sales, your GUI, which trade shows you attend, which articles you write, who you interview, all that sort of thing. If you're just focused on one sector, can that be a big enough moat so that your Clarity, Dragos, Nozomis, Tenables, Microsofts, and such can't get over that moat, that you can maintain a sizable position in that sector-specific market? It's the best example I've seen where someone's trying this strategy. So I think it's interesting in that sense, and it's something that's worth watching. I will say that picking rail is probably a good strategy because the others don't have much market penetration there. Now, it might not be a good strategy because it's very resistant to implementing cybersecurity. So they're much further back than even things like building automation. So there's a lot of pioneering work there, but it's a strategy worth watching. But we spend most of this episode not talking about product, just talking about rail systems, the rail market, rail security standards. So I hope you enjoy my discussion with Miki Shifman of Cylus. Joining me on this episode of the Unsolicited Response Show is Miki Shifman. He is a co-founder and CTO of Cylus, which is in Tel Aviv. So this is kind of an interesting time for us. It's 6 a.m. here in Maui, 7 p.m. in Tel Aviv. But Miki, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dale, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm an avid listener, and it's great to come here for an interview as well.
Well, it's exciting to have you on because we're going to talk about something that I know very little about. So that's always a good thing for me because I know I'm going to learn a lot in this episode. I've done work in almost every industry sector that has ICS, but I've done no work in rail. And Cylus focuses on rail security. So I want to really dive deep into what is unique about rail and what is the problem with rail. And I thought maybe a good place to start would be on the consequence side here. What are high consequence events that can happen in the rail environment due to a cyber attack or a cyber physical attack?
Yeah, so that's a great point to start, actually. So, what is typically defined in rail as a consequence event is one out of two. One is safety issue, and the other is service availability issue. Um, so, until a few years ago, safety was kind of considered granted just by rail being 200 years and more in the area, and many people assume that mechanical systems are still there or the new developed digital systems are still as safe as the previous one. What has actually changed over the past few years is that cyber attacks uh, considered as something that can lead to safety consequences as well as part of the analysis. And now actually cybersecurity is analyzed along with safety. And by safety instead, I mean anything from having two trains going on the same piece of track and the signaling system not working properly, having a train driving too fast, if you compare it to what's the allowed speed on the specific piece of track, and you can let your imagination go with it. Service availability is another part of rail, and it's actually something that is considered a bit different in rail because service availability is basically when train stops, but in rail, actually train that is moving is the exception. So the train starts from validating different conditions, and only if all the conditions are met, the train can move. And it's kind of like based on safety analysis or availability analysis that um, makes it like assumes that there is going to be a very low probability that the train will stop, because if it happens once, next time it's going to happen is a few years from now due to a specific conditions. But what we actually see is that cyber attacks can quite easily cause service availability disruption. They can stop trains. Many times, even the messages the trains receive to stop are not even authenticated because it's not even considered an issue, like if the train stops. But maybe like taking a step back, lots of the current systems that operate trains, so like when you look at a train that is moving, is actually a consequence or result of a message that is being sent to the train and allows it to move. A digital message, as we know it,
Yeah.
some even goes over wireless, not very secure wireless channels. And
Well,
stop train,
maybe let's try to break it down a little bit here. So
yeah.
I my only experience in rail was there was a gentleman in the United States named Dave Tuman that was trying to look at it, trying to get the rail community in the United States to take cybersecurity seriously,
Mhm.
probably 12 to 15 years ago. So he was really a pioneer at the point, and there were certain issues that were there and have been there for decades. And then there were certain issues that were coming based on new technologies. Like back then, positive train control was
Right.
viewed as a future, something that was coming and they had to prepare for. So if we split it that way and really focus more on the safety side first, what are the systems that someone could hack into that could cause a problem? I'm assuming there's some signaling systems that could tell tell a train to go this way and tell another one to go on the same way for a potential collision.
Mhm.
Is that the main risk if we were to look back, systems that have been around for 20 or more years, or are there other systems that we need to worry about as well?
Yeah, so signaling is actually the core of a rail system, and typically it's divided to signaling and train control, and sometimes they're considered the same system. But in general, that's the system that is responsible for the alignment of the signals along the track, and many times it's called interlocking. And on the other hand, you have complementary systems like positive train control or ERTMS that are being used for commanding the train itself, if you compare it to commanding the field elements or the wayside infrastructure. Um, the simplest way to look at the systems that might bring the like that cyber attack on them will lead to the biggest to the worst consequence is actually the systems that are considered safety systems or SIL4 systems. That and in those you can include interlockings, which is part of which is the system that is responsible for aligning the field elements and the point machines and the light signals and so on. You can consider some of the train control systems, although not all of them. So, for example, PTC is not one of them. But with PTC, you can cause a train to stop, but actually making it move faster is quite impossible if you compare it to other systems that you have more in the
Hmm.
subway space. And other than that, you have the onboard systems. So in onboard, you have the systems that are responsible for the braking and the traction and everything that is more safety critical on board. And of course, some of the onboard signaling systems, which are the interface to the outside worlds. If you look at the rail on board, cyber
And
attack.
on the signaling, just to jump in here on the signaling now, is and I'm sure there's a wide variety. You were talking about a global market, rails all over the world. There's older systems, newer systems, but is most of this signaling going directly into the train, or is it signaling alongside the track? I'm sure there's both, but what drives it? Like, if I'm responsible for the operation of that train, and if I'm getting a message in my train saying it's this, but my track signal is something different,
Yeah.
what do
So,
I rely on there?
so it's actually both, and it really depends on the system.
Okay.
So, for example, PTC is more doing most of the calculation on the onboard side.
Yeah,
ERT
let's set aside PTC for a second. Let's just talk about pure signaling.
so in pure signaling, like if you think about it, the train itself, it doesn't have too many degrees of freedom. It mostly can
Right.
decide whether to stop or to move and in which speed. So that's kind of like
Mhm.
what a train can do. The rest is depending on the alignment of the other point machines and the signals and the other trains that are on the track. So it's an integrated system, and a damage to either part can lead to a consequence. So if the train receives a command to move faster and it's not allowed to move faster, it's going to be an issue. If the tracks are aligned in a way that two trains will enter the same track, the same track section, it will be an issue. So I guess it's both. Per your question, in both of them, you have different technologies. So on the signaling end, we mostly look at computer-based interlocking systems that are that are the movement towards more and more digital systems to control the actual wayside alignment, and that's what opens, of course, also cyber like that expands the cyber risk. And on the train control side, you have systems like ERTMS, CBTC, PTC that are more controlling the train itself and has a variety of commands that can set to a train, and that's the threat vector towards the train.
Well, we've seen now something I'm much more familiar with. If you look at the oil and gas space, they'll have safety systems at various SIL levels, and there's a big debate as to how integrated those systems should be or can be from a security and safety standpoint. So, for example, in Triton, we saw they were connected. So, if you were able to talk to the ICS, you could probably talk to the safety
Yeah.
system as well. Where are they in rail in that thinking? Are they integrated together, separated and moving towards integrated and moving towards separate? What is the thinking in the industry at this point?
I think in the broad level, they're separated and moving toward integrated. So uh, what happens with most of the neural systems that they take multiple capabilities and typically integrate them into similar devices. They start, of course, by being completely separate, so every line would act in a different way. But the more you move forward, you get more standardization on the signaling interfaces and on the train control interfaces as well, and that's for interoperability purposes as well as just to spur some of the proprietary technology that you cannot actually control. And also, I think that for purposes of easier predictive maintenance and reducing the total cost over a lifetime of an asset, they're moving more towards integration. Of course, for security, there are other constraints that should be taken into account, but it doesn't mean that like you need to disconnect everything, or like if it's possible even to disconnect everything, because we still have some issues over there.
Hmm. I haven't heard a lot of incidents in train systems. I remember years back there was somewhere, I think it was in Poland, where some youngster was able to change a local signal by basically sending some wireless command to the signal, but that appeared to just be a local signal on the side of the tracks that he was changing.
Right.
Have there been other incidents, uh, other or any high consequence incidents as a result of a intentional cyber attack? I'm sure there's been incidents that were cyber related, but not part of a cyber attack. Things break,
Yeah.
but actual an attacker causing a high consequence event.
Yeah, I think that the latest one that was public was the one with the war between Russia and Ukraine and an attack on trains in Belarus. So actually, the whole movement toward looking at trains from both the passenger perspective, but also from the freight and even military shipment perspective, is something that opens the door to more threat actors. And what happened there is that trains or train dispatching systems were attacked for the purpose of delaying supply of military equipment to Russia from the Belarus train tracks. So that was just one recent example. What we've been seeing since 2020 basically is dramatic increase in the different reports on cyber incidents in rail. Some of them are more detailed, some of them are less detailed, some of them mention that the train control system was targeted, some of them are kind of like keeping the details. But we can see that trains in general or rail systems in general are being more and more targeted in the recent years. And I think that also the threat or the attack surface is expanded for those systems, and that's also a reason for that. And there are
Yeah,
different
yeah, it's
motivations to do
classic.
that.
Like every other sector is going through the
Yeah,
same thing,
kind of like
and
the
as
cyber, yeah, in general.
yeah, as you said that, I guess if I think about service disruptions as opposed to safety related consequences, I can remember in San Francisco they had an outage a few years back. I don't know if it was their BART or their larger system there that they have, but related to the ticketing system. There
Right.
was some cyber attack that brought the ticketing system down, so there was no way for people to pay to get in to take the train, and that took them out for a day and caused havoc across the city because it was so widely used. So I could totally see or imagine that there have been many of those incidents that I haven't heard about around the world. When you're talking to the rail community, which one? I'm sure they care a great deal about safety. Everyone cares about safety, but maybe it hasn't hit home yet. Maybe they believe they're safer than they really are at this point. Which one is getting the attention of executives more? Service disruptions or safety? Which one is getting them to say, it's about time we start really looking at security?
It's a good question. I think that in service disruption, the case is a bit simpler because with safety, like, okay, so service disruption is something that has a very measurable ROI, and it's like you understand that what service disruptions means for you, for your brand, for the passenger, or for the supply that you need to provide.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's also well understood that it's fairly simple to take down the rail system from specific points for like as a service disruption. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's something that I think that people understand it. On the safety side, it really depends. It depends on the people. It depends how they see it. So I can say that one of the things that happened in the past few years in rail is the standard called TS 5701.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like for those of you who are not familiar with rail, TS 5701 is a work by a European startup body called Senelec. It's like the European version for IC. And we know IC 6243 from other industries as well. And TS 5701 actually takes um, IC 62443, or specifically -3 within it, and tries to apply it toward rail systems and kind of like play the game of what's going to happen if you try to apply it and what is applicable, what is not, and how you relate to different operational aspects of rail. But also an interesting part of it is that TS5701 looks at a safety analysis that happens in many rail systems and actually gives you a formula on how you conduct cybersecurity analysis as part of your safety analysis. So it actually says for the first time, and that's something that happened only in the recent years in rail, that for having a safety case, which is something that every rail system needs for safety purposes, you actually need to do a cybersecurity analysis. And it means that explicitly there is an admission that safety and cybersecurity are intertwined, and you need cybersecurity for safety. Without it, you're just not safe. You cannot assume any type of safety. And that's where you actually can get into analysis of different failure modes and whether they can happen or not because of cyber attacks. But that's something that we're seeing. And the notion and the industry itself has changed a lot over the recent years. And even the ones that never admitted that cybersecurity can somehow be related to safety now have to do it, now have to conduct a cybersecurity analysis as part of safety.
Yeah, I looked at that standard. I read the article and watched one of the videos on your site, which is cylus.com, which has a lot of information. If people are interested in rail, there's a lot of webinars in that with rail asset owners and others. It looked like that standard was a combination of 3 different standards. So you were using 62443 for some things. Was the risk analysis part, was that CSM-RA document that it references, or was it the EN 50126?
EN 50126, as far as I remember, yes.
Okay. And this standard, again, TS-50701, is that something that's a voluntary standard like ISA or IEC 62443, or is that something that the European Union or some countries are saying you must comply with this?
So the interesting part about the standards is when it was written. So I think that the CENELEC group is a group that if you join into, your country, like the standard body of your country, needs to respect the standard that was accepted, and also it means that regulators will also need to relate to that. What we're effectively seeing is that many of the, especially in Europe, many of the rail companies, when they specify new systems, they specify them together with having PS5701 compliance. We're also seeing a similar trend in some countries in Asia that are taking the standards, and I guess we also see it in other parts of the world because you don't have many such documents that talk specifically about rail and the different constraints that rail systems have.
But that's causing you the same sort of problem that we see with 62443. I saw even a kind of a joke about that on your site where you're seeing that in RFPs that you must be TS 50701 compliant, but that's like saying you must be 62443 compliant. You know, it's more, a lot of it's a methodology, some of his requirements, it doesn't really mean much. So it's a good thing and a bad thing if it starts people looking at it and saying, well, what the heck do I mean? Because the vendors are going to push back on that. If you say you have to be compliant, they're going to start to say, well, what do you actually mean by that? I know some vendors will say yes, naively, but you really would say, okay, well, what are we talking about when we say compliance? Are you seeing any of the asset owners further down that maturity level where they actually understand the standards, understand what to ask for? Are there any asset owners that are real market leaders in terms of pushing cybersecurity and cyber safety forward in the rail industry?
Yeah, so maybe to relate to your previous comment about the vendors, an interesting part about rail vendors, at least the ones that specialize in developing rail signaling and rolling stock, is that many of them have been actually part of writing the standard. So they had representatives in those groups. And I think that also for them, they can look at it as a form of normalizing their cybersecurity for future systems, because developing rail systems is a costly process, and getting the cyber requirements only in the end of the development is something that is complicated. So they also have some motivation into doing it. Unfortunately, of course, there are always ways to improve standards like it, but I
Mhm.
believe that it's a good process to at least start talking about it, having something that says that you need to add on cybersecurity into your systems. And from there, of course, there will be practical challenges that relate to implementation and how effective it is, like in real-time operations. Because currently, of course, it's the beginning is only paperwork, but I guess over time the maturity will grow related to this standard, and you will have extensions of it that take into account various practical aspects of implementing it. Um, Regarding your question about like development of asset owners, so the interesting part is over the past few years, um, we're seeing the maturity grows in different regions. So we're seeing operators ahead of the curve in the US, in Europe, and also in other places like Asia and Australia. And these operators, they typically take cybersecurity for the rail systems quite seriously. They actively search for solutions both for their new systems as well as for their existing systems. They try to implement standards that are coming either from the OT security space and, of course, these new rail standards, and actually like start building some sort of a framework, security framework that takes into account their rail systems. They try to understand their visibility, their ability to respond to different types of incidents, of course, to detect them. And we're seeing all of it. And we're also seeing a similar movement from the integrator side. So one thing that we're proud of in Cylus is that we are the selected vendor by Alstom, which is one of the largest players
Mm.
in building rolling stock and signaling systems. And we, of course, also work with others in the space. And the idea is that we're seeing this motion coming from both ends. On the third, I guess the third part of it is the regulations. So you can see regulations as a TSA security directive. Although it's quite new, it's kind of like it pushes the ones that haven't taken steps yet. And some of them, of course, for some of them, of course, it's very basic, but for some, it also gives you some guidance into moving forward with your plans. And also, of course, an NIS directive or an NIS2 and standards like TS 5701, they kind of like they set the targets for operators, and, and, and they kind of like now as a rail operator in 2022, you can't actually avoid uh, taking seriously cybersecurity of your rail systems. You cannot say things that you could say 10 years ago.
Well, what are you? I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are on the TSA regulations that have come out recently. I mean, they were sort of born in a funny way. They were born out of the Colonial Pipeline incident.
Yeah.
TSA in the United States is responsible for pipelines, even though transportation, you wouldn't necessarily think about pipelines being
Yeah.
under there, but they are under there. And I think what they did was they said, "Oh, we have these other systems we're responsible for. We've kind of dropped the ball on that. We need to pick that up." And they came out with some very crude requirements of having a cybersecurity coordinator reporting to the government within a certain time period, having an incident response plan, and doing a vuln assessment is
Mhm.
kind of where they started. What are your thoughts on the TSA requirements? Are they going to help the industry, hurt the industry? What do they need to be improved? What are your thoughts?
So I think that for some, I think that these regulations are out there already. So the idea is that they're there, and companies need to react. For some of them, it won't do anything new. Like some of them will have already everything in place, and not necessarily it will not necessarily bring any additional value for them, and they will not have any extra work coming from this regulation. Some of them will for sure need to do something about it, and implement new techniques. I think that the whole process of uh, I think that what we all want is that cybersecurity for those critical systems that power our day-to-day lives will be better. If regulation is a way to achieve it, then it's great. And if not, like people can always like take different frameworks and implement it themselves. Um, but like I think I think that all in all, some companies for sure will benefit from it because they will at least have a good argument to implement cybersecurity, and it will, of course, improve also their safety as a consequence, while some of them will probably not do much. What we're seeing, for example, is that even this basic requirement for having a proper incident response plan is something that for sometimes it requires you, for example, to map your assets properly or understand what you have inside your system. And once you start digging into it, you start realizing lots of other things. Same goes for vulnerability assessments. Some companies still haven't had like formal vulnerability reports over the rail systems, and they might think something that is not true about their security posture.
Mm.
So these are helpful. I think that CISA does some of those or helps with some of those vulnerability assessments, and so does the TSA. So I think that in general, companies, uh, at least some of them, will get better in terms of cybersecurity from this process, and it will also make them think more about their security posture.
When I looked at your site, we talked about some of the, I guess when I split it up originally, I was talking about some of the technology that had been around for 20 years or more. But then when I looked at the site, it looks like there's newer technology that's allowing greater density of moving cars on the tracks, because they're not relying on humans to keep them separated. They're relying on algorithms to plan that out. And so you can have more on the track. You can move things faster, move things with less traffic jams and all sorts of issues that you might have if you didn't have those models in place. Does this mean that we're getting to the point where even some of the higher speed, higher value trains are being deployed without conductors on them, no people on them running those trains? I mean, I know in certain cases the machines are doing a lot of it, but there's still a person there. Certainly in the small trains, your airport trains, as an example, there's never a person driving that train anymore. And you see even in many cities, a lot of the metro trains are unmanned
Right.
trains.
Right.
Are we getting to the point where that's going to be the case for even a high-speed passenger rail or important freight trains, or are we already there? I really have no idea where we are in that
Yeah.
maturity
So
curve.
So actually, we are already there for some of the freight rail. I think with passenger, it will take some more time, but I think that the first use case for it in the mainline high-speed rail will be in freight, and it's already happening. You have companies like Rio Tinto in Australia that already operate such trains, and you're seeing also some of the Class 1 railroads in the US and some companies in Europe testing or operating such technology. So yeah, we are definitely on the way there, and we have already the components for it to happen. We have automatic train operation systems. We have automatic train protection systems that are more responsible for the braking and the safety of it. And you have other components that you need, like systems for detecting the size of the train and things like that that are more complicated on the freight side than on the passenger side. But at the same time, we already see it happening. So yes, we're definitely there, and we will have many of those trains in operations over the next few years as well.
It's one of those things where the technology can be there. We've seen it with haul trucks, for example, in mines. A lot of them are driverless trucks and such. And even if you look at cars today, driverless cars are so much safer than driver cars.
Mm.
But that the fact that the technology is there isn't driving public opinion.
For sure. Yeah.
Are you seeing resistance in the rail market to move to driverless in some things, or is that coming from regulators, or is there no resistance?
Mm, um, so depends where. I think in metro, as
Okay.
you mentioned, or in urban systems, it's effect. So I assume it will happen. It will also be effect in other systems as well. I think it depends on aspects like different countries and maybe their labor unions or aspects like that that
Mm,
might affect it as well. Because in the end, like it's not the same like having driverless car and having a train. So and having a driverless train, especially in the mainline field, because you don't have as many trains as you have cars. And the fact that you can spare one driver for hundreds of passengers, not necessarily worth sparing the driver in cases as you mentioned. So it really depends. Um, but um, but yeah, I think that I think it will just happen with some companies, and they will understand that it improves safety in different aspects. And over time, what, in my opinion, is going to happen uh, with the attended trains or the drive trains is that if the default mode of operation will be having an unattended train or having a driverless train, um, it will be hard to go back. So I think that you will use drivers only when they're needed, and you will have other roles that are more responsible for remote operation and things like that. But I guess that the world will change toward that direction.
Okay, well, maybe just to finish up, I wasn't aware of your company.
Right.
That's not a surprise. That's not a take on your marketing department. There's a lot of companies out there. I don't know all of them, and of course, being based in Israel and focusing on Europe, we don't do a tremendous amount of passenger rail in the U.S. So we don't aren't quite as active in rail. So it's not a surprise. But one of the things that did surprise me was when I looked at what you did, what Cylus does. To me, it looked like a classic OT detection play that I've been covering closely for the last 6 years, but specifically rail focused. So you're basically passively monitoring a network, looking at the signals, determining what's on the network, what if there's vulnerabilities on the network, if there are things going over the network that might be risky or don't make sense. Um, but very rail specific, looking at rail protocols, rail applications, and such. Uh, would you characterize yourself differently than that, or is that pretty much did I nail what you typically are doing with your product line?
Right. So first, I'm happy that I'm here. If you haven't heard about the company, so it's already a good excuse for being here. Um, with regard to the question, so let me maybe characterize what we're doing comparing it to that and comparing it to other OT players that you might that you are.
Okay, do it in a minute.
Yeah, I will. So generally, if you think about uh, rail systems, they have different characteristics in terms of assets, in terms of protocols, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of technologies. And if you look at the operational aspect, it becomes more complicated. So one of the things that we're doing as an example is we're actually visualizing the rail context together with the cybersecurity context to help rail operators understand cybersecurity incidents.
Right.
And without having those pillars, you can't actually move to a consequence-driven approach. And that's something that we discussed earlier. But to understand the consequence of an event, you actually need to understand the operational part of rail. And you need to understand what a signaling system is. You need to understand what types of assets exist in rail system, and understand the consequence and the risk like derived from that. And that's something that we do at Cylus, and that's where we differentiate ourselves. And other solutions are great, but in order to apply them in rail, you actually need to do all of it to be effective. And that's what we specialize in. That's why we built our technology over the past 5 years, as well as like worked with major operators as customers, uh, and and that's why leading rail vendors chose us as their security solution. So
Yeah. But you're essentially hanging off of span ports or doing taps or doing other things to gather traffic going over rail-based control and safety systems, and then bringing it back and analyzing it for so you know what's going on, identifying threats, providing advice as to actions being that should be taken and such. Right? Is that
yeah, I guess, but the
that?
magic here is what happens from the span port until the GUI. That's like where the magic is, and
Oh, of course.
there's a lot to be done there. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of funny. I've really spent a lot of time analyzing the market, and on one hand, the market is kind of shaken out that there's a big three, across the entire OT space with your Dragos, Nozomi, and Clarity. Uh, but I have written that if someone is going to take a part of that, essentially the Cylus strategy is what I've said could work. I'm not saying it will work, but just a very, very tight sector approach where you just are saying, we know more about this sector than anyone else. We're tailoring our product and our analysis and our GUI to this sector. So it will be interesting to watch Cylus. Now, on the flip side of that, these large vendors are dealing with many vertical industries already. A lot of times they were doing energy and they said, oh, it'll never work in water. And guess what? Now they're supporting water protocols. Do you think that Cylus has a big enough moat in terms of rail expertise to keep out these other big players if they decide all of a sudden that rail's a market they want to go after?
So the answer is yes. And I actually believe that they will need to make the same amount of investment that we have made, which is many years of engineering and researching, as well as like real world customer experience in the rail sector and rail operations to get to a similar level of benefits that the customers will get. And also to get to anywhere which is effective. Because again, like these solutions are great, but when you try to apply them in rail, you end up with low visibility rates and you end up with low ability to actually operate an incident. And that's where actually rail expertise is needed. So my answer is yes to that.
Yeah, the packet stuff is not that difficult. I mean,
Yeah,
these are packet junkies. They can handle new protocols really quickly. I think it's the context, the discussions that where a moat is possible, and it'll be fun to watch to see. I mean, I'm an outsider. Maybe it's more than just fun for you. It's you and your employees' lifeline, whether this works or not. But it is an interesting approach. I see you raised $30 million in a Series B in December of last year. So the company has recently raised some funding. Have you announced how many people are in the company at this point? What's your size?
Yes, so we are currently 70 employees, and we keep growing, and we keep, of course, like expanding into new markets. We expanding our engineering as well as sales and marketing operations, building new partnerships with players because like the players, like there are many cybersecurity players that of course are beneficial to rail companies. We specialize in the rail operational side, but rail companies as a whole, they have more systems than just that. So all in all, yeah, like we keep growing and we have great we have great customer stories already and great partnerships that gives us this advantage in the market, and we always keep up for new challenges. Yeah.
Well, if people do want to learn more about rail security, as I said, there are a lot of webinars and such on Cylus.com. Talk about the different systems, talk about the standards. You can certainly get educated there. Miki, if someone wanted to contact you, which of the socials are you active on?
Yeah, so I'm active mostly, I think, on LinkedIn, and of course via email. I can share my details later on. Always happy to engage and to discuss, and always happy for interesting conversations about the technical aspects of rail and, of course, different security approaches. So please feel free to contact me. Actually, my email is quite simple. It's miki@cylus.com. So just
okay.
feel free to send me an email, and I'll make sure to answer that.